Hey guys, this is Lucas from Better Coding Academy. I am back with Patrick after a long time. Um, Lockdown has hit Sydney hard, and we have finally got bored enough to do another pair programming ish video today. I think that the interviewing style videos recently have done quite well, and they're relatively popular. So I figured we'd do something similar and just kind of come back. This time, Patrick's going to be quizzing me. Patrick is a very accomplished developer in his own right and by his own words. So he hopefully should have some very interesting stuff for us to look at today. We could do some sort of like programming problem. I guess it could be like React or just JavaScript or like Node or whatever.
Sure,
Um,
sure, sure.
yeah, or
Yeah.
like some scenario. I guess just anything really that you think would be that you would like to ask someone who you're interviewing and trying to hire onto a particular team, for example.
Actually, let's go for like kind of architecture level of coding. So like system design. So not particularly algorithms, but kind of, just abstraction. Because I think that stuff is a bit more important. Like algorithms is kind of like maths, right? Like architecture is like a little bit more of an art form and it's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more interesting.
Yeah, cool.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. So maybe is there a particular like an app online app that you kind of like? Because we can just talk about like trying to clone it at a very basic form. Something like Twitter or Twitch or something like that.
Yeah, we can do something like Twitter maybe. Let me pull up a.
Yeah, let's just pull up um a safe Twitter feed.
There we go. We're rooting for you, September. Okay, confirmed it did. My computer is lagging, and I am waiting for the new maps to come out. They're taking too
Cool.
long. So
Do you wanna take a screenshot and maybe just paste it into like Paint? So there should be like an online
okay, yeah,
clone.
yeah, easy, sweet. I'll just do this. Cool. Um,
Maybe
okay.
zoom, sorry, maybe zoom out so we get like a little bit more of the
I can.
feed.
Okay, yeah, sure. So, all right. This is a
Sweet.
screenshot. So,
In this, yeah, can you like edit at all, like paint over it? You can't. Can you like
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
draw?
I can like draw stuff.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, cool.
Yeah,
This
we
is
just
fine.
need to draw white boxes. Like, yeah. So let's get rid of stuff that we don't care about. So I think like ads and stuff, let's just blank it out, like what's happening.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think that's an ad, right? That's actually like feed.
I don't think I have any ads on this one here. I think this is just actually
Uh,
all content. Yeah. So this is like, I guess, what is happening in the news. It seems to be localized to Australia as well.
yeah.
This is like the actual Twitter feed. And yeah, I guess this is more promotional. This is like the media. This is generic nav. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, let's blank out the new to Twitter.
Okay. Hold on.
Just because for our exercise, let's assume you're logged in.
So
I
let's
think that's
assume this is not part of it.
yep, yep. And then of course all the content would shift up to fill up the space.
Okay.
All right. So let's yeah, let's talk about how you would make this. So I guess in a maybe an interview setting or something, right? I would literally just ask like you'll get given a problem and basically a wireframe version of this, right? And I would just ask yeah, how would you come about of designing a system like this? Maybe start from either the front end or the back end, like data structures, etc.
Okay.
Up to you.
Yeah, so I guess to give a little bit of context, this is actually a pretty common type of more advanced interview type question, I guess, is when you actually are given a problem without a very clear, like, can you solve or build this one thing? It's more like, how do you design something? And then that includes a lot of assumptions and a lot of thinking around, like saying, okay, well, there is no right, there is no wrong, but it's just how you work through that problem. And then in that process, kind of challenging a lot of assumptions. So just for the viewers, that's kind of what we're going for in terms of direction.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe we can like talk about this a little bit more because it's meant to be more educational, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why I liked how you said this is more of an advanced level. So often see this like maybe in round two or round three, not in the first round, because round one is just like just prove you can code. So it's kind of a screening process, right? So the reason why the second round is kind of more open and more often referred to as a whiteboard kind of session, I guess, is the interviewer wants to understand how you approach problems and also adapt to changes. So that's kind of the intent of these questions, which is why it's open-ended. So with that in mind, um, I guess one of the early tips for the people watching is like you want to make sure you can communicate and explain thoroughly your thought process. So sometimes people know the answer because they've kind of seen it before in other code bases and they just use a solution. Let's just example, right? Let's just say, I'm going to use React and Redux. But like there's no explanation. So if you just
Yeah.
come straight in and be like, I'm going to use Redux, right? Like there's a 50-50 chance, honestly, the interviewer might ask you why or, like what's the reason that you came to that conclusion.
Mm.
If you can't explain it, then it's like, what is the interviewer supposed to do, right? Like they can't really mark you up for picking a solution that you can't explain.
Cool.
Anyway, I have my own style, different people have other styles. But anyway, yeah, so I guess the just to loop back the question, the first initial question, right, is like how would you come about designing this? You can start from the front end or the back end. I would probably recommend you to have like some kind of drawing thing open
Okay.
because I
Yeah. Sure.
suspect,
Sweet. 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 So what
yeah,
I will
either
do,
typing or drawing, yeah.
I like to use draw.io because personal preference. So I'm gonna have that open as well. Hopefully this doesn't lag my computer too much, but we'll see. Okay, and I'll put this one in landscape. So I'll keep this one here. I think like maybe to start, there's not really too much that I, want to kind of diagram first. I think maybe if it's okay with you, I'll start with like kind of seeing how I'd approach something like this from the perspective of saying like, what do I see Twitter as like being? I think like also I think it's also important to like for me to look at it from the perspective of Twitter, what it is now, as opposed to where Twitter started. Because I think if you're designing a system from the beginning versus architecting something at scale, I think there are also different considerations to make as well. So what I mean by that is like, for example, if you are starting Twitter in like, your parents' garage or whatever, then I don't think you'd necessarily architect it to be like the next billion-dollar application. I actually think that that's kind of over engineering. But then on the other hand, I think that if you look at it in terms of the approach now, I think it's important to consider more of the kind of architectural scale challenges that kind of apply to it. So I guess in terms of one question I have first is how do you want to approach this? Is like from the perspective of a Twitter clone that we're starting to kind of eventually evolve into something which may be larger, or do we want to start this with like I'm coming in and being tasked with designing the optimal system for Twitter as it stands today? How do you kind of see between those two?
So I think the okay, so I guess the premise is let's make a premise. So we're kind of like an existing company, right? We have like a reasonable amount of users. You don't have to assume that we're as big as Twitter, but I think it's safe to assume that we want to be able to handle the capacity one day of Twitter.
Yep.
So we don't want the system to be limited in that sense. Um, yeah, and you're coming in, I guess, as a full stack engineer.
Cool.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I guess it's more around like an evolution of scale. So we're moving from where we are now, where there are possibly some limitations to our architecture, to something which can handle Twitter in its current state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I'm assuming that the system doesn't exist though. So
Okay, all right, cool,
yeah,
cool, cool.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's fine.
yes, so it needs to handle large scale real time data, I guess.
Okay. Okay, so I guess for something like this, I'd probably start with first talking about the backend considerations. And my reasoning for that is that for something like Twitter in its current state, I would say that it is powered by a very powerful backend, and the front end is kind of just like it's a representation of the data that comes from the backend. So, obviously Twitter is built, I think, using quite a bit of React, and it's, you can tell because this icon here is blue as well. They did embrace React, but, you could have easily used Angular, or you could, like you could do it using plain JavaScript if you wanted to, or you could handle it all on like the server side and render it that way. So I think that's not really the main thing I'm considering when looking at something like this. Probably my foremost consideration is around how we're going to build out the backend, and specifically, the main business elements of the backend that we need to consider. So one of the things that kind of first comes to mind is, talking and thinking about the the parts of Twitter from a business perspective that actually kind of help it to generate revenue. So obviously Twitter is built upon advertisements, but kind of taking a step back from advertisements, advertisements are kind of built around the concept of having revenue. So what actually generates revenue for the business basically? And I think that the most fundamental concept there is having tweets, having the ability to follow other people and to read their tweets and then to be able to post tweets. And then I think in terms of the media, I kind of see that as like a subset of that in the sense of like you've got tweets that can contain media and then media is just like a representation of that. And then you've got what's happening, which is kind of like the most important tweets or, maybe news articles that have been linked around quite a fair bit. And then that once again built off of the foundation of having the structure to handle large numbers of tweets.
Yeah.
Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, sure. What you said is true. But yeah, you're coming in as an engineer, so let's get started.
Okay. Right. So the first thing I guess I'm thinking about is handling tweets and handling. So you've got, for example, like let's just take a basic system. So this is kind of where my mind's at the moment. Is you've got, for example, we'll call this person user A, and this is say user B, and say this is user C, and this is obviously a super simplified model of the Twitter user system. We've got 3 users here, but you can imagine that this could potentially be tens of millions, billions of users, etc. And the relationships between these users specifically is that user A could be, for example, could be follows user B, so we can do something like that. I might actually move this arrow up because we might need to put an arrow back as well. And then let's just say that user B follows user C here. And then potentially we could have user C come back to follow user A. So it might be something like this. And let's just say that user A also happens to follow user C as well. So maybe they're friends or something like that. And there will be a follow relationship there. Clean this up a bit because I'm pedantic about that. So this I think is like the most fundamental model of the relationships between users here. And I think that this is important because this is like, if you kind of look at it like in terms of layers of data, the way I'm kind of envisioning it is like fundamentally it's about these relationships between users and then how we share those tweets between the users who actually care about them. So for example, in this case, I'd say that if user C posts a tweet, then that tweet would be seen by user A and user B. If user A posts a tweet, then user C will see it, but user B won't necessarily see it, and we can talk about retweeting and that sort of stuff. And if user B posts a tweet, then only user C will see it. So that's kind of like, I guess I'm just illustrating that point to talk about the user model here is what I believe fundamentally underlies all the tweets and all that type of stuff on Twitter.
Are you able to draw this a little bit more formally? So right now, this is just kind of like a flow, right? Um, yeah, but I guess are you able to draw it in a more formal language or like a type of diagramming technique that you know of?
I haven't done any diagramming techniques.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no
There's like
problem.
every time I try to look into UML, I forget it. But like there's something in I think it's like the different types of arrows you can use around
Yeah,
that. But
okay.
I don't have a lot of
Yeah.
experience in that.
Yeah. So maybe I'll pause it. So normally, in an interview, I let the person go. So what I'm fishing for is like right now, like this actually only shows one object model, right? It only shows user,
Hmm.
but you have 3 boxes. They're not separate data models. It's just one. So it should be a user, and the relationship should be following itself, and it should be a many-to-many relationship.
So the way you'd see it is having a single user here. So to represent the actual like wait what it's not letting me copy.
Yeah. So you can just delete all the boxes besides one.
Right. So
Because
so
like right, yeah. Because right now you're drawing instances of users, right? User A, user B, user C. But
mhm.
in like architecture, you don't draw instances of things. You just draw the actual like the model.
Okay.
You just want to represent the relationship. Yeah. So you just have a recursive arrow that says follows.
So you just do something like this, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And you gotta denote like the how many. So is it one user follows many users follow one user, many users follow many users. So just like input, output. So I think in this case, it looks like many to many, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one user can definitely follow many users, and many users can follow one user. Yeah, so it should be many to many. Well, the relationship is follows, like you say, whatever, right?
Okay.
And then
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
and then on yeah, so that's just follows, and then on the output usually they just have like M, and on the input they have another M to denote um yeah
Oh
that
yeah,
part.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Um yeah,
Yeah.
so that's what I was fishing for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but normally like I wouldn't interrupt the interviewee. I would just let them do it,
Okay.
continue with whatever they're comfortable with.
Cool. All right.
Um, but anyway, yeah, let's keep going. Yep.
Yeah, I definitely need to like practice my modeling. So part of what I wanted to show with that diagram earlier, with like the different boxes, was the way I kind of see that, and like what I was kind of going for there is that in my mind is a representation of a, a graph database in a sense. So you have like these individual nodes, and you have the relationships between them as well. So part of what I wanted to show there was that this type of data structure can be very easily encoded within a graph database. So for example, if you have the user A, user B, user C as different nodes in your graph, then the relationships between them are actually quite valuable to that graph database itself. And that was kind of what I was going for there in terms of like representing that structure, if that makes any sense.
Yep. Yep.
So let
Yep.
me.
So yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So part of what I'm thinking about here is like, in terms of storing the actual data around the user, is having your different users together and then being able to also store those relationships. So something like a graph database here makes a lot of sense to me because you have individual users. You also have tweets later on, but these things are all very much interconnected. So you'd be able to kind of look at these things and be able to very quickly kind of extract relational information about them, because you need to say, find, for example, how many users are following this particular user, and then all those users would receive a tweet from that particular user, for example. So I think like very much in my mind, like in terms of the database choice I'd go for is probably something that's like not GraphQL, just Graph, or like I guess like a kind of for the very strong relations that you'd be able to do within a graph database.
Yep. So is there a reason why we like what about some of the other considerations, right? So it seems like you picked graph, but that's technically kind of like a schema and interface as well. So is there a reason why you wouldn't go REST or maybe even choose, something else like a Mongo or something?
Okay, so my understanding of this one here is my differentiation. So I accidentally typed GraphQL. That wasn't my intention. What I'm talking about here is more around like, for example, like I guess the three types of database I was thinking about were like you've got like your traditional like relational database, like for example like MySQL or Postgres or whatever. Make this larger, and you might also have. Can I put this text on the left? You might also have like I guess a more document-oriented database, or like a NoSQL type database, something like potentially looking at like document might be like MongoDB sort of, maybe like Dynamo. That type of structure is more I was thinking. And then the third type I'm thinking about is you've got relational document and then you've got graph. So graph is more like Neo4j. I think Amazon has one as well called was it Neptune? I think AWS Neptune is another one. But like Neo4j was the main one I was thinking about. So kind of these three types of databases, and I was considering how you would represent this kind of model in these three senses. My reasoning for going with graph in this particular case is so I guess if you look at the strengths and weaknesses of each is for document databases, I'll start with document, is they tend to have really well self-contained data. So if you have a lot of different documents, as you call them, and they contain a lot of data that's like kind of internal to that particular model. So for example, you might be storing like a list of resumes, or you might be, handling a lot of, maybe even like recipes or like orders, that type of stuff. Is then you might have a lot of stuff that's kind of self-contained within each document and not that many relations. So in those cases, I think that document would make the most sense. If you have a lot more relations with data, and you have to kind of a lot of one-to-many type relationships. For example, you might be building like a coursework system to say you have, for example, a teacher, and then all the classes that teacher has, and then all the students in those classes. It might be something more appropriate for a relational database, which lets you handle that. But then when you have a lot of many-to-many relationships, that I find is very well represented in a graph database. So you might have, for example, a couple users, and then those users are following a whole bunch of other users, and in that sense, it's a many-to-many type relationship. So you'd have for example, like I showed before, user A, B, and C, and how they kind of follow each other. And that was more what I was referring to.
Yep. Okay. So sweet. So it sounds like so that's the relation part. So what about the graph part? So I mentioned why would you not pick a REST interface over a graph interface?
So are you referring to here, like, I guess, REST versus GraphQL, like for the...
No, no. Well, to me, like what you just wrote looked like graph is kind of the schema as well, right? It's how you interface with the actual API, right?
Okay, so I think my consideration there, so I haven't really gone that far yet.
Mm.
In talking about like, how do I draw GraphQL? I think there's actually GraphQL shape as well. Nice. Okay, so you have like, I guess, GraphQL versus, I wonder if there's one for REST. Is that REST? No, what? Okay.
No.
Yeah. GraphQL versus, I guess, REST. We can just write this. Nice. Okay. So in terms of like backend considerations between REST and GraphQL, I haven't really gone there yet. So that wasn't my intention when talking about like the databases and that type of stuff.
Right.
But in comparing these two, I think the main thing for me is that for something that kind of allows for longer term evolvability and inter-device interoperability, I think that GraphQL makes more sense. So my justification for that is that if you are accessing, an API with, for example, from your mobile device, which uses the Twitter application, from a web device, which uses obviously the Twitter web interface, and potentially via some API as well. And then in those cases, it might be like a custom Twitter bot that checks certain messages or responds to things in a certain way. I think that the API requirements for each of these is quite different, and the things that they're trying to optimize can also be quite different. So for example, for the mobile app, it might be really important to, and it is mostly the case, is that the amount of data sent over the network is quite a limiting factor, especially on slower connections. So in that case, I think that having GraphQL queries helps to overall slim down the package size being sent. And then I guess the other consideration there is that you'd be able to, due to similar reasons, limit the actual data that you're returning as well, in a way that is kind of built into the language itself. So although this is a separate point to databases and the relationships we have there, part of my thinking here for GraphQL in particular is that that there is a lot of benefit to having the ability to customize the individual fields of the schema that you're actually looking for. So that would probably be my main choice for the most part. So I would see it as like GraphQL over an HTTP interface without much consideration of REST.